Greetings, everybody. Welcome to the UPstanders podcast. My name is Dr. Omékongo Dibinga, and I have an incredible and powerful guest. I want to introduce introduce the people in my podcast because the world already knows who this incredible woman is, to Dr. Anna Malaika Tubbs. Dr. Tubbs is a scholar, advocate, and best-selling author of a book that's on my shelf, The Three Mothers: How the Mothers of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin Shaped a Nation. Her latest book, which is an instant New York Times bestseller. What? Yes, it's called Erased, and it takes on one of the most ingrained and insidious structures in American society, patriarchy, and dissects how it has been both historically rooted and actively maintained. With meticulous research and unflinching clarity, Erased pulls back the curtain on the many ways the American patriarchy has shaped every corner of our lives, harming not just women and marginalized communities, but men too. With a PhD in sociology, a master's in multidisciplinary gender studies from the University of Cambridge, and a bachelor's in medical anthropology from Stanford University, Anna translates her academic knowledge into clear and engaging stories. Time Magazine, New York Magazine, and CNN have published her articles. Anna's storytelling also takes form in her talks, including her TED Talk, which has been viewed close to 2 million times. Woo! I could go on and on and on, but I think y'all get the picture of how incredibly powerful this woman is. Dr. Tubbs, how are you doing?
Thank you for that introduction. I am doing so well. I feel like because you're using video, I do have to tell people that I have a sty on my eye. My eye does not usually look like this, but I was crying when I found out that the book made it on the New York Times bestseller list immediately. I couldn't believe it. And so I think my body is now just very tired. So other than that, I'm doing really well.
I wouldn't know about the whole mascara thing, but if I got an instant New York Times bestseller, I might have some other things going on with my face too. So
You just cry
congratulations.
a lot of emotion, and I'm so grateful for it. And I think, but also, when you work really hard, this used to happen to me in undergrad, where once finals week was over, my body would then crash. I was suddenly sick, like all the things came up. I feel like that's what's happening the week after the good news. So here we are.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. So, when I interview incredible people like yourself, I like to start off with a question that I don't hear in other interviews.
Mhm.
So, at American University, where I teach a class on Jay-Z and historical biography. My doctorate's on Jay-Z. And when I'm talking to the students about hip hop, I say that the why and the how of hip hop is more important than the who and the what. So I tell them that who Jay-Z is more important. I mean, that is not as important as to why Jay-Z is. So I
Mhm.
want to bring that question to you. Why is Dr. Anna Malaika Tubbs?
Oh, that's such a great question. The why for me is revealing the stories that others try to erase and hide and bury, and being the person who corrects that. Because without that knowledge, without challenging the dominant narratives and the dominant storytellers, the blame continues to be placed on those who have been hurt the most by those same sources and those same people. And so, for me, the why and the motivation is to be the one who corrects the record and makes sure that we actually can confront what we're facing and actually move towards healing. So that's my drive.
That is powerful. I can completely understand where you're going with this. Now, for those who aren't familiar with publishing, people often, you submit your book 6 months, 9 months in advance. And so we're in this space right now. What was it that led you to feel like this book, Erase, would be necessary at this moment right now?
I know it feels a little bit prophetic, to be honest, that it came out during this presidency. Although it would have been relevant regardless, sadly, but especially the timing with this second presidency with President Donald Trump, I knew that we needed a text that explained how patriarchy operated in our nation when I was even a little girl. I was raised by a staunch feminist mother who advocated for women's rights in the US as well as abroad. And I had the opportunity to travel to all these different places with my mom, with my parents, but I was especially inspired by my mother's work. And just seeing how all these different places were organized. And then coming back to the US as a teenager, I always saw the US slightly from an outside perspective. And so I was able to study it that way and compare it to the different places that I'd lived. And I found it fascinating, even as a little kid, that although the US presented itself as a very progressive nation, and in many ways, yes, that is true, when it came to our relationship with gender and the gender binary, we were not quite as ahead as people thought that we were. And so that's one of the reasons, my childhood, my mom, why I wanted to write this book. But fast forward through Three Mothers and my first book, and everybody who reads it feeling very shocked that the three mothers, Alberta King, Berta Baldwin, Louise Little, the mothers of MLK Jr., James Baldwin, and Malcolm X, respectively, did everything that their sons later became famous for, long
Mm-hmm.
before their sons were even a thought in their mind.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone feeling shocked that we didn't know that before my book, that this wasn't common knowledge, that we didn't realize that MLK Jr. knew about marches and boycotts because his mother was an expert in this as well, and that this was largely what he inherited from his maternal lineage. And so that's just one example of many where people feel really surprised. And when people asked me, how did these women get erased? Why did we not know this? Why wasn't this again common knowledge? My first answer was, well, patriarchy, but the way that that operates in the US is that it's always inextricably intertwined with racism. It's intertwined with a history of slavery in the US, a history of removal of Native people from their lands, a history of erasing and denying Indigenous belief systems, and all of the above. And people don't realize how it plays out to this day. So beyond my book, I'm also always thinking about its application to current events. So when I said, okay, I want to write this book because we need something on American patriarchy, Roe v. Wade was overturned.
Mm,
And
wow.
many people across the US felt very surprised by this, felt very caught off guard by this, felt like this could have never happened in the US. And we're trying to find answers to how indeed it did happen here. And I was sitting there thinking, this is not shocking. We
Mm,
can be disappointed. We can be angry about the fact that Roe v. Wade has been overturned through Dobbs, but we cannot sit here surprised. And if you are surprised, it's because you don't understand that this nation was built as a patriarchal system. And so these confirmations of why this book was necessary continued to pop up as I was drafting the book. And when I had almost finished, President Trump was reelected. And I knew I had to go back in and write the afterword just to make it crystal clear that everything I'm talking about in the book explains how we arrived at this moment.
that is so powerful. So you end this particular part, what we're talking about Trump. And one of the things that I would say to people, when people talk about the election, they said, well, he had a 7, 8 month head start on Vice President Harris, because he was already in the campaign. And I say, no, he had a 250-year head start because he ran on the idea of white manhood. He used everything about protecting whiteness and protecting men, and he put it together. Like you said, there's a race aspect of it as well. And he ran on all of that. Vivek Ramaswamy, he's a man, but he couldn't run on the whiteness, right? Nikki Haley is a woman, so she couldn't run on the man part. But and some of these other people, the DeSantises of the world, they didn't go where Trump went. He knew. Well, what are your thoughts as it relates to that? The way that Trump used the patriarchy that has been built into this system to usher himself into office again.
I completely agree with that analysis. I completely agree that this is not anything brand new that he was wielding, but in fact, I also say that we've been in this battle against American patriarchy for 250 years since the Constitution was written. And so I 100% agree with that interpretation. And I would also say we see it very clearly in the presentation of his attacks on trans people, because there was a moment, at least polls were showing us, that when Vice President Kamala Harris entered the race, that it looked like he might lose. We had some hope, right? We were all thinking this is possible. But then he ran a particular ad against trans people. And this was one of the most successful moments in his campaign because many people said, I disagree with him on a lot of things, but on that, I agree. And so for me, this is so critical in our understanding of American patriarchy is that a lot of us don't realize that we are protecting American patriarchy subconsciously because we care so deeply, for instance, about a gender binary. And American patriarchy and the way in which our founding fathers defined who gets to be man and who gets to be woman set up this very problematic, rigid, and limited binary. But everything after all of our other identifying factors are also organized around this binary. And people have been told throughout American history, in order to be treated as a human being in the US, just try your best to assimilate to these two categories that were presented to us by our founding fathers, that men were to dominate women in their lives, men were the ones who could vote, men had power, men could enter into business decisions without anyone else there to speak for them, which we see clearly that's leaving out a lot of men from the beginning. It's leaving out enslaved men, it's leaving out indigenous men, it's leaving out poor men. Then we also see that not in the Constitution, because women are not mentioned in the Constitution at all, but in letters that the founding fathers wrote to the women in their lives, to the daughters in their lives, to each other about the women that they were related to, that women were supposed to be protected, women were fragile, women couldn't think for themselves. If they did, they would need to be controlled. They couldn't be trusted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But even in that definition, we see clearly that a lot of women are not being considered in that category. We see that women who are forced to work day in and day out clearly are not being quote unquote protected. And so instead of a lot of people combating that now throughout history, because we've erased traces of that history, people then want to just assimilate to those roles because they want to be treated as human beings. And so when something like a conversation around trans identities comes up, people want to protect the social order because they see it as their path to humanity. And so one of the many tactics that President Trump used in his pursuit to be reelected was this protection of the thing that people would say is their objective truth, even though that required so much fabrication, so much construction, so much erasure of identities that, for instance, Indigenous people recognized before American patriarchy was created by the Constitution. So there's so many examples I could point to. So many of his executive orders point back to let's return to this original social order. But that one in particular really sealed the deal for him.
Wow, that's so real. So you would basically say, I mean, we both know that when people say it was about the price of eggs, we knew that it was never about that. But you would say that, or not put words in your mouth, would you say that even though there were men of all different backgrounds who maybe felt like, I'm going to vote for this guy because of the economy, I had more money in my pocket, et cetera, which we know was nonsense, actually you think the underlying real thing was the manhood piece. He's
Yes,
protecting manhood. I'm a man, not these people, these trans athletes, less than 100 of them, or the statistic says, whatever it is. And that's really what made him more appealing to
yeah,
some of the black male voters that voted for him, the Latinos that voted for him, and of course some of the white males. You feel like that was a deeper issue.
absolutely. 100%. And I will stand by that because but it's also that they don't necessarily realize that that's why they would want to vote for him. They don't always realize that they have been tricked into thinking, I have to fight my way up this ladder that I've been
Mhm.
shown is the way to get power in the United States, the way to gain recognition in the United States is to assimilate as closely as possible to the quote unquote elite men that the founding fathers presented themselves as being and set up a system through the rules and the laws that they instituted to make it so that that's what everybody aspired to. Get as close to this as you can, and then maybe you'll understand what it is to be human in this country. And so you see so many men of color thinking, I simply need to be better in this role. Maybe that's why I'm not accessing resources. Maybe that's why my family is being torn apart. Maybe I'm not man enough and I need to step into that. And maybe if I protect that social order, protections will be given to me as well. And so I do want to say, however, that in both the Latino male voting group and Black male voting group, they did still overwhelmingly vote for Vice President Kamala Harris. So we often in this critique are kind of dismissing the fact that the majority of them voted in the way that we would want them to. And we do have to applaud that. But the trend towards an increase around people aligning with him is what we're concerned about. And I think if we don't understand that it has to do with this protection of a gendered identity, this believing that that's my path to humanity, is what's at play, then we're going to miss it again, and it's going to continue to happen until we call it out directly.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point. So many people talk about, black men, went towards Trump. And it's like, 8, 9% or something, like 80% of black men, voted for Trump and more, Latinos, broke for Trump, but people equate them to the two groups as the same, which I think is really problematic.
Yeah.
I want to let people know that what the book is about before I get to some of the solutions that you feel like the book can help people with. So if you all are getting familiar with the book, part one is about our shared humanity and ancient wisdom. Part two is our intuition and self-determination. Part three, our capabilities and strength. Part four, our creativity and joy. Part five, our sense of safety and community. Part six, our interconnectedness and courage. I wanted to read that to people because I feel like when people feel like there's any conversations about the patriarchy, that everything is just going to be negative, doom and gloom, men are trash, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I wanted them to hear that you're talking about the real issues, you're going into the history, but you're also through all of this, our sense of safety and community, our interconnectedness and courage. There's also a hopeful message in here about this is something that can be changed if we just have the will to want to do it.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought that up because I knew that patriarchy was a buzzword that causes a lot of emotion for people. But I honestly have actually been surprised by how defensive people are when they hear that word and the immediate assumptions they're making about what I might be saying when it comes to patriarchy. And so I'm not at all attacking one group of people. I'm not at all attacking all men by any means. Instead, I'm saying this is a system that our founding fathers decided upon, and that was initially just their opinions on how the country should be organized, opinions that then turned into our national guide, and how every policy that then came out of that all relates back to this initial system. And so, of course, we're going to see traces of that still to this day because it's also been strategic that we haven't had access to knowledge that explains the connectivity between this initial document and this initial vision and, for instance, our current Supreme Court justices. If we don't see that connection, we then spend a lot more time blaming each other. We are angry with each other because many of us are not having our needs met in this nation. And so what I'm trying to do is explain how we got here, not by alienating any individuals, not by critiquing them, but by saying you have to know because either, you were able to have access to certain resources as a result of how the system set everything up, or you've been denied those things. And without understanding how we arrived here, we can't move past these misunderstandings that continue to come up. It's also not a book where I'm saying Democrats have it all together and Republicans do not. I actually think we see it in our two-party system. We see patriarchy playing out constantly. And I'm also asking that we envision beyond that. I'm also saying that when I say, for instance, in the book, I talk about burning the book of patriarchy, I'm not necessarily saying burn the Constitution. I'm saying that initially the definition of man left so many people out. The definition of woman left so many people out. This binary is leaving people out. There's many more of us, if not all of us, who are actually not included in these definitions. And that means we actually haven't seen democracy in the United States because power has not been vested in all of the people in the United States. And so I'm actually advocating for, can we finally see what the great experiment of American democracy can be if every single person does have access to power, does have their vote, and actually it will count towards something. And
Mhm.
so a summary of that is what I'm advocating for. The opposite of American patriarchy is not a country where women control men and where women take power away from men. I'm
Yummy.
not advocating for that. It might be a faster solution if we have to, choose one way or the other.
Uh-huh.
But what I am advocating for is that we each have power. And that is something that's incredibly hopeful. And we can work with the Constitution to make that happen. And I find that to be incredibly exciting. And so this book is not anything that we've seen before in our analysis of patriarchy. That's why I'm coming with something fresh and something new, because my opinion on our inability to dismantle patriarchy is that we've never before been given the full definition of it.
Most definitely. And so your book has me thinking about, I want to attribute to Dr. King, but I'm not sure. But somebody talked about, when we talk about the pain of the person who was enslaved and the spirit being broken, we also have to think of the spirit of the slave master and how that is all, because you have to be broken in mind to do the types of things that you would do to somebody who's enslaved. And
Yes.
so on some levels, slavery hurt everyone on different levels, of course. You make the argument in your book that the patriarchy actually hurts everyone.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because some people, when we think that the patriarchy is, men out there saying, hey, I'm fine. The system is set up for me. Like you mentioned, women aren't mentioned in the Constitution. So I'm good. These other people who aren't men, who are however they define themselves, they got to figure themselves out. You make the argument that we all suffer.
Yes, we all do suffer because, as to your point, if you have to deny your interconnectedness to people because this, again, binary, this initial opinion, this system has told us you either dominate or you're dominated, and that's the only option that's
Mm.
available to you, then you're setting yourself up for either a world where you're dominating people, but you're unhappy and you're not connected to them, right? Where we see very high levels of depression amongst white men, high levels of suicide. Mass shootings also count as suicides because they're often these missions to not only hurt others, but to end your own life.
Mhm.
And we know these are overwhelmingly white men who are performing these horrific acts. We see high drug dependency. I mean, this current debacle between President Trump and Elon Musk, largely resulting from the revelation that he was on several drugs, which again, not surprising if if we were watching, it seemed kind of obvious something was going on. But that is a testament to even the men who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of this system are hurting deeply because
Mhm.
the whole thing is made up. It's fabricated. It's not, in fact, the natural order of things for people to choose domination or to be dominated. That's actually not how our nature operates. We can be and should be communal. We can and should be encouraged to listen to our intuition. And when I was writing this book, I had a moment where I thought, oh, some of those words are a little bit cliche. Maybe they're a little corny. Maybe people won't take it as seriously if I'm saying things like interconnectedness and like, is this a self-help book? But I realized that that's part of American patriarchy is to tell us that those things are too soft. Those things aren't meant to be reclaimed. But that's where the solution lies,
Mhm.
is recognizing that we have been trained to dismiss those things in our lives in our pursuit of power, in our pursuit of money, which is just another way to say power and to hold power
Mhm.
over other people. And so it really is seeing all of us more on the same team against the system that is American patriarchy.
Mhm.
And when I talk about those who try to uphold that system, I say, it's not only men, it's not only white men who uphold that system. There's a lot of women who either consciously or subconsciously are protecting that system because it's what they've known to be true. It's what they've become comfortable with.
Mhm.
Why a lot of white women, if we're talking about how people vote, are voting in a way that seems like it's against their self-interest. But if you look at our organization of our nation from the beginning in this way, actually, white women have a higher place in the social order, and they might not always realize how badly they want to protect that. But in that, there's a realization of the intersectionality of oppression and how much harder it is to exist outside of this binary because people of color have also been excluded from this binary. It's not only trans people, it's not only non-binary people. Many of us have been removed from it. And so, yeah, we just have to become much more aware of how more of us would actually benefit from dismantling the system, and even those who have been told you're the winners here, we're seeing evidence that that's simply not the case, and they're not living joyfully.
Yeah, yeah. I love the fact that this book has the history basis, but how it's so based in current events. And one of the things I'd like you to share with the audience is what do you do in the book as it relates to this idea of banned books and connecting that to power and fear and the patriarchy itself?
Yeah, the book, when I initially decided this is the book I want to write, and I told my editor, and she's like, "We love it, go forth and write this book." I initially had this moment of overwhelm because I thought, oh goodness, I've set this up so I can write the go-to book on American patriarchy so that everybody finally understands it. And then I thought, but it's in everything. How am I going
Yeah, yeah.
to write this book? How is this? How? And so I thought, okay, I will organize it where I'm walking through my own life of coming to understand American patriarchy for what it is. And first talking about my mom and how she came to understand American patriarchy in her life. And that always means we have to contextualize her story, what's happening in our nation at the time in the 50s. And she's a white woman and she wants to become a lawyer. And her dad, says, that's really more for men. It's not something you're supposed to be doing. And so I'm also explaining that this was the culture. It wasn't just in her family that these messages were coming across. We're seeing it across the nation. And so as I'm walking through these chapters, I then move on to my own life. And I'm going to tell you about what was going on in our nation when I was born. And it's the year of the woman. And it's right after the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings,
Mhm.
and how that sets up my interaction with American patriarchy. And so
Yeah.
that's the reason why I'm always making sure that I'm applying it to the context of what's happening in that moment, but also what we're seeing today. Because I'm constantly trying to connect those lines so that we stop feeling surprised, so that we stop getting caught off guard, but instead we can trace it back to this initial system. Because unfortunately, today, there's a lot of people who would say patriarchy just doesn't exist anymore.
Mhm.
Look how far we've come. And people have asked me directly in previous interviews, you have 3 degrees, you're doing well. How could you say that
Man, that's
patriarchy was a
crazy.
barrier for you? But that's what explains why we continue to get surprised because we
Mhm.
are missing those connecting lines. We're not connecting the dots. And a book ban or multiple book bans is just one strategy for making sure we erase those connecting lines so that we can't trace it back, so that every time American patriarchy rears its ugly head, we are surprised and we think that all of these moments are separate examples, that they're unrelated to each other, when instead they're symptoms of the same disease. And so we have to directly address book bans. We have to directly address anything that tries to keep us from understanding the connective tissue. Because when you can see the connection, then we continue to move in the right direction, which is I'm saying, yes, let's celebrate how far we've come. But if you erase all of the things that it is tied to, those rights that we have gained become incredibly vulnerable because we saw it again with Roe v. Wade, something that was fought for years and years and years, and wasn't everything we needed. There's so much more that's necessary for reproductive justice in our nation.
Yeah.
It was a start. It took that for it to go away. And so for all the people who are saying, but look how far we've come and like, does it even still exist? Absolutely, it still exists.
Yeah.
Many of the gains that we've made have been very recent. I talk about even, the smallest things like women having a right to breastfeed in public. That's within the last like 10 years in some states.
Mhm.
So we cannot take that for granted. And it's even more of a reason to talk about how we got here.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have like 100 more questions, but I'm really going to try to stick to these last two questions, if that's all right.
Yeah.
I I'm seeing a lot of programs out here where governors and schools in different places are saying like we need to have more programs to deal with men, to engage young men. They're feeling, alone. The stories about, living in their, parents' basement or the video game culture, and men are being excluded and so on and so forth. Now, I'm raising two daughters, and my youngest is a boy as well, and so, and I work in a lot of schools. So I'm clearly concerned about both of their, all of their, emotional stability and so on and so forth. But part of me is feeling like you all are talking at the same time, like you said, a lot of these school shootings and things, they happen from men, majority white men and everything. So there's a violence fear there. But at the same time, I feel like, wow, we're about to just ignore women again
Mm.
as we create these new programs. Well, what am I missing, or what am I right about, or somewhere in the middle on, as it relates to how do you see how this idea of the patriarchy fits into all of these conversations that people are having about how we need to engage men more?
Yeah. And I agree that it's a hard thing anytime you're talking about gender and the binary, of course, that's been created, but of course now the inequity that it's created. And then in order to address that inequity, you have to replicate the binary to talk about it.
Right, right, right.
So that's what makes it so complex. But when people ask me, how should I parent my son? A lot of people ask me that,
Hmm.
so that he isn't a patriarch, so that we can have more good men out there. I always say, as a parent, we're parenting all of our children differently when we're thinking of a world and a nation that is separate of American patriarchy. And in the final parts of the book, I talk about how, from a moment a child is born or a child comes to our nation, what that life would look like if we're no longer replicating American patriarchy.
That's
And
powerful. That is so. I gotta say that is so powerful.
thank
Absolutely.
you.
No,
One
please
of the
go
most
on.
important
I
parts.
just had to share that.
I appreciate that. One
Mhm.
of the most important parts of that is asking children who they are versus us from the beginning placing them into boxes. And we do it constantly. We're constantly saying, don't listen to your intuition, child. Like, you're actually supposed to sleep for like 30 more minutes and it's not time for you to eat yet. Like, even those little things are actually a replication of order. And we think that there's a specific order that children are supposed to follow. And that's even before we get into wear this color or don't cry if you're a boy or all these things. But
Mhm.
if we can think about it more from the perspective of any child, regardless of gender, and we're approaching them saying, tell us who you are. And here's a quote that I often come back to because it's just so beautiful. June Jordan said that every time a child is born, the world begins again.
Wow.
And I encourage parents and anybody in relationship with children, teachers, to, instead of telling them to fit the world that they've entered, to ask them what world has begun with you and to always have that curiosity around them.
Mhm.
We will then be able to avoid a need to go back and help boys and men with their emotions. We will then avoid this need to go talk to men and boys about not asserting power and control over the girls and the women in their lives. They
Mhm.
don't come into the world with that. We taught them that.
Yeah.
And so at the same time, in order to address the inequity that's happening for the boys and men who have grown past this initial childhood where we could intervene right at the beginning, um,
Mhm.
we do have to have some conversations around, why do you feel that you have to control people around you? What's going on? But I still think that this can be a communal conversation boys, girls, everyone. It doesn't have to be this, we need to go after the men. And that's just not how I approach things. And I have also been telling people in all of our relationships, we're often replicating American patriarchy and we don't realize that we're doing that. And
Mhm.
so for this book, I hope that a lot of couples, especially heteronormative couples, read it together and say, how is this showing up in our relationship? How are we reproducing this, even when we didn't mean to, rather than, hey, men, get your S together. So I think it's both, but I lean more towards how can we all have these conversations together?
That's right. That is powerful. And lastly, could you explain the cover? Because when I looked at the cover, it said everything to me in terms of what the title of the book is about. But then I'm like, when I look at the cover and the color and I feel like I might even be missing something.
There's
Is
so
there
much
something you want
there.
to break down about the cover itself?
There's a lot of layers to the cover. I am so in love with this cover. The designer did such an incredible job. And then the artist who made the figure in the background also is just such a beautiful collaboration. So I really can't take a lot of credit other than saying that they just really brought the vision to life so beautifully. I wanted a cover that showed one, a non-binary figure to really like get us out of this conversation of man versus woman. But also that throughout the cover, we have the ombre background. So we're starting to see the person better. So initially you can't really see them towards the bottom. That's that erasure. We're allowing them to kind of blend in and we're not taking that time to really see the figure. But as we're getting to the top and similar to as you're reading the book, that person starts to become much more apparent to us. And even the glossiness of that figure and a different material against the background allows them to stand out a little bit more. So it's the reclaiming of all that's been hidden from us. And then, of course, it's in red, white, and blue with some purple tones because I really am advocating for what American democracy could be. This is actually a very patriotic book in a lot of ways.
Yes, it is.
But
Absolutely.
also, yeah, the blending and challenging that it's not either Republican or Democrat. There's so many more layers to this, and we're going back and forth a lot on the subtitle and what color it should be because the red felt very intense, but that's the tone that I wanted in a way as well. We have to address this. We have to do something about this. There's urgency.
Urgency for real. Wow. Where can people go if they want to learn more, follow you, get more information about the book, bring you to their town?
Thank you, everyone. I would love that. Everything is just my name, Anna Malaika Tubbs. So at Anna Malaika Tubbs on Instagram, and my website is annamalaikatubbs.com.
The book is Erased: What American Patriarchy Has Hidden from Us with Dr. Anna Malaika Tubbs. You have to read this book. You have to really do a deep dive to understand the history of patriarchy, how it manifests today. We talked about it here, you all, as relates to books, as relates to politics, and we know daily is playing out in the politics. If you need a guide for not only how to understand patriarchy and most importantly, what to do about it, how to dismantle it, how to see it, how to talk to your kids about it, this is the book that you need right now, which is why it is a New York Times instant bestseller. Dr. Tubbs, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you all for tuning into another edition of the Upstanders podcast.